I think that the issue is really about how do we be good allies when we are not part of a community where these debates, are centered. In every community where this is practiced, there are feminists who are speaking out about it and who are creating the change in their own culturally specific way within their communities.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Farzana Doctor, psychotherapist, registered social worker, and author of several books, the newest of which has just been published in September of 2020, and it's called Seven. It follows a woman named Sharifa of Indian heritage, specifically of the Dawoodi Bohra community. Now, Sharifa and her husband and daughter go back to India in part for a research trip and in part for her husband's work. What she finds there is not just about family, her ancestors, but about something called female genital cutting or female genital mutilation. Now, this is a practice that carries on around the world in various cultural communities, specifically in India and specifically in the Dawoodi Bohra community. It is this issue that Farzana has been wanting to write about for some time, and this book really tackles the problem, not just from an intellectual or historical perspective, but from a deeply personal and emotional one as well. In spite of all of that, though, this book is quite fun, interesting, heartwarming, and often funny. We're going to talk about how Farzana wrote that book, why she wrote it, and what we can do about this issue. Now, before we get to my conversation with Farzana, I'd like you to do me a favor. If you like this podcast, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on Facebook or on whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, for all previous episodes and for the show notes about this specific episode or any other, so you can find out more about what we talk about specifically and what we reference in our conversation. Finally, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, social media, or at the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca, please get in touch with me. Let me know what you think of this show, all of the episodes, what guests you think should be on this program, and what on earth you think is going on. Farzana Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Oh, I'm really excited to chat with you. I've read your book, Seven, which was really powerful and really insightful on many levels. It was insightful about you as a writer, insightful, I think, about your community, the Dawoodi Bohra, insightful about India, insightful about something called Katna, female genital cutting, which the book isn't obvious right away, but it becomes clear that that's kind of the main issue that we're grappling with. And what an important issue that is, multifaceted, and something that I've wanted to talk about on this podcast for a long time. But that's not the whole book. There's so much more to it, and I want to really dig into this with you. But before we do, I wanted to give you the big question, as I always do. And it's a question that sometimes can sound pedestrian, but is not meant to. It's meant to encapsulate the world as it's happening and the urgency that we seem to be feeling day to day with the big questions and the big issues. Some of them are dealt with in your book, Seven. But Farzana, I got to ask you, what on earth is going on?
Well, I think that, one of the things that I've been really thinking about is just how powerful this moment is, that we can actually talk about this form of gender-based violence so openly. Like, we can have a conversation about this, and also to talk about a form of gender-based violence that makes us all really queasy, like me included. This is a moment in time that hasn't existed much before.
Why is that?
So Katna, or female genital cutting, is this issue that is so shrouded in silence. It's such a taboo issue, and that's kind of part of how the violence happens. Victims are told never to talk about it. Sometimes they're told that nothing actually happened to them. So then there can be like a lot of confusion also coming over the victim. So it's a very hard issue to talk about. And when I've tried to talk about it with people in my family, even the ones who are supportive around the book or the activism, they kind of don't want to talk about it because it's a trauma, and they have been told never to talk about it. So I think that's that's the really key thing. And I think if we can start to normalize these conversations, which is happening right now in this moment in time, if we can start to normalize these conversations, we can really like poke holes at all the mythology that exists around the practice. And then it's going to change.
Right, of course. I mean, one thing that is interesting I found in my research about you is actually, even though this book is coming out now in 2020, you've been talking about Katna for over 5 years. I saw an interview with you from 2015 where you said this needs to stop, it's a problem, and then I'm so glad that you made it into this book. But when we talk about an issue like Katna coming to the fore, and being talked about, even though there are many people who have had it done to them or who do it or who simply support it and who think it's an important part of creating a community, for example, even if it's just a symbolic cutting. You know, this is something that is dealt with in the book, that there are fake katnas as well. But it's still a form of, a fake katna is still a form of cutting, even if it's not an actual physical nick. There is still an act of taking away or an act of violence being done to a person.
Yeah.
And as this,
and
sorry, go ahead.
I should say that the fake Katna thing is a fictionalized bit. I don't know if that actually exists in truth. The fake Katna that we are aware of, you know, through stories that people tell us, is that they'll say to a mother-in-law or a grandmother who is pressuring someone to take their kid for it, they'll say, oh, yes, we've already gone for it. So that would be probably the most likely fake Katna. But I create a little bit of a subversive kind of activist move that can happen around fake Katna. So that's complete fiction, just to let you know.
I did read, though, that there are such things as a symbolic katna, so where the act is done, but it is seen as not actually meant to prevent sexual pleasure for the girl later in life, that it is purely symbolic, but there still is a ritual to it. And to say that rather than not going at all and saying that you did, you do go to see a person that does it, but it's just more of a symbolic gesture. But I think that there still is a physical act to it.
I think there is. And I think that the people who call it symbolic are the actual proponents of Katna. They are saying, it's just this little nick, it's no big deal, it doesn't do anything. But the truth is that this isn't a standardized procedure. It's done by these amateur cutters in often unsanitary conditions. Even when it's done in a medical setting, because that's starting to happen too, doctors are starting to do this, it's not standardized. And when you think about the anatomy and how delicate it is, especially on a child, whatever is symbolic is still really painful and damaging. And the other piece of what I talk about in the book is that the psychological harm might be the greater harm.
Right.
For some people, it is the physical harm that is the greater harm, but the psychological harm, I think, is huge because, you know, you're stamping shame on the body. You're doing this confusing, like weird thing to a girl. She doesn't know what to think of it.
And it's such a formative age, the age of 7, when Katna is performed traditionally for so many girls. And in this book, it's performed. At 7 years old, I mean, we're so receptive to the world. We're so malleable and changeable. And an impression like that, and especially an impression that we can't remember because of I don't remember much of what I did and who I was when I was 7, but those things still happened to me and they still form the person I am today. And I think that dealing with trauma, and I think this is partly because you're a registered social worker and psychotherapist, it's clear to me that you understand the 360 degrees of trauma. And that is evident in this book. But going back to this idea of the social debate that's going around about female genital cutting, not just in the Bohra community, but all over the world, and for male circumcision as well, it seems to me that and this is maybe a general question about political and social debate, when we have an issue that's underground and simmering under the surface, there seems to be a huge middle ground where no one really knows or they pretend they don't know, and it isn't, although there is certainly harm being done, it isn't polarized. And in our culture today, whether it's because of social media or just our political structures, once an issue comes to the fore, we suddenly become divided in for and against. And that happens in this book. I mean, Sharifa, the main character, tries to take the middle ground between her two cousins, who are, at the beginning anyways, for and against this practice. And I just wondered, is that something that you see in the world at large, but also in the debate around Khatna, that once we kind of start grappling with it in public, we collapse the conversation into a binary?
Yes, I think that that's really true, right? There is for and against. And one of the things I really wanted to do with this book, and you can do it with fiction, and maybe you can do it in other forms too, but with fiction, one of the beautiful things is that you can create all these stories and all of these experiences. And I really wanted nuance so we could understand what does it mean if you are in a middle ground? What if it means if you're pro Khatna? And like, why would you be there? What does it mean if you're sort of silent about it, unsure? I wanted all of the nuances because all of the characters who are grappling with this are victims themselves. Some of them are perpetrators. And I think that is the messy middle that most of us are in for a while. And, when we put on our activist hats, for sure, we have to say, this is wrong and this is why, and it's child abuse and it's trauma and yada, yada, right? But I think sometimes we alienate the people who are in the messy middle when we are so polarized. So I was hoping that this book would present another contribution to this movement so that people could understand it from a wider perspective.
Yeah, and you do a great job of that. I think there is nuance in this book, and at no point was I ever thinking, well, this character is a villain or this character is the hero, just because we're talking about a cycle of abuse. We're talking about violence done to those who then practice the violence themselves and may not even see it as violence.
Yes.
And you're right. I mean, can we do that in other media? We certainly can do it in fiction, in storytelling. That's almost the whole point of storytelling, is to show the gray areas in between and how the world cannot be just collapsed into for and against. But when you were writing this book, was there fear that, or any sense of trepidation that you were writing about something that a lot of people hold sacred?
Yes. As an activist, I was often kind of in the background. As an activist in general, I've tended to organize the events. Maybe I'm the interviewer on the stage. Maybe I'm the Twitter handler. I'm kind of in the background. I'm not the person speaking about the issue. And so I knew that as this book was progressing, that would shift and I would need to stand on the stage in the spotlight and talk about the issues.
Yeah.
And that really scared me, to tell you the truth, because I was grappling with my own experiences of trauma around this. And again, the trauma experiences don't help. And then I also wondered, what would the family members who are pro Khatna think of all of this? Would they gaslight me? Would they say it didn't really happen in the way you said it happened? Would they say she's lying? So I really did have a lot of fear about what this would mean when it came out into the world. But the fiction itself, the book itself, I feel very comfortable with that. Fiction is something that I think is just a beautiful way to present an issue. It was more, what would it mean if I was the spokesperson? I had never done that before, except in very, very minor ways.
And how does it feel now that in a way you are? I mean, I'm not saying that, obviously we're talking about a piece of fiction, we're talking about a book that deals with these issues, but this is something that you are now having to talk about in a conversation just like this. I mean, does it feel, I mean, are you, yeah, I mean, is it uncomfortable in any way? Is it difficult? Do you feel fear? And I guess I'm asking this not to probe into your emotions so much as to find out how you've gained the courage to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've had to do lots of preparation. I started thinking about this maybe a year ago. I did some mock interviews with journalist friends so that I could feel out in my body, where was my line? What did I not feel like I could talk about and what could I? And that line has moved, by the way, as I've gotten more comfortable speaking about this issue. So there was a lot of preparation. There was a lot of therapy. I'm a psychotherapist and I believe in therapy. And so I went and I did a lot of work around my own issues so that my own inner child could feel calm and relaxed as I was as I'm talking about these kinds of issues. So it did require, and it does require, lots of self-care. So the other piece that I'll do is I'll create lots of buffer time before and after interviews like this, so that if my nervous system is a little peaked, I have an opportunity to let it come back to equilibrium.
Do you think that those lessons about self-care apply to other creative people who are doing personal work or just doing artistic work, whether it's writing a book or making a painting and trying to dig into your subconscious and your psyche and find the truth that is within, which can be really emotionally taxing work. And we forget about self-care. Sometimes we romanticize the idea of just, getting up early and staying up late, just do the art and get it done and put out in the world this old Ernest Hemingway view of writing and creating art. Do you think that these lessons of self-care apply more widely than just dealing with a personal issue? Or,
Probably, yes, because the act of creation can be pretty heart-wrenching. There were some scenes I was writing, and while they're fiction, I found myself just feeling really sad, or sometimes the opposite. There were some scenes that made me laugh too. So yes, I think so. What I hear most from writers, it's when you're addressing an issue that you have some personal experience with, or you're writing memoir, you need extra support, extra self-care, because it's when it goes out into the world, when it leaves just your desktop and your little private home, and it goes out into the world, and then you need to be able to talk about the issues and maybe address some personal questions. That's when you need extra help.
Going back to Khatna, or female genital cutting, this was a subject, not Khatna itself. I wasn't aware of Khatna until I read this book, but the overarching question of FGC, or FGM, female genital mutilation as it's sometimes called, was a fascinating question in the social sciences that I grappled with when I was in my undergrad at university. And it was fascinating as a debate because there was no obvious answer to what someone like me, a straight white male from Canada, able-bodied and definitely privileged, can do about these things that are happening for the most part, not exclusively, but in other countries and definitely other cultures. And the debate being, this is, for me, I'm sorry, but this is wrong. I can't see a world in which I could say that this is okay in any culture, in any way, in any country. And yet at the same time, who am I to go marching around the world in a colonial way to tell people what to do and how to live their lives? And this is a classic question of the modern world, whether it comes to female genital cutting or democracy or free trade or the treatment of females or gay rights, for example. This is something that we feel something so deeply, but we also know that people on the other side of the fence feel just as deeply, but in the opposite way. And I wondered, this is an interesting question for you too, because you're speaking from a position of almost on both sides of the fence. You're Canadian, you live in Canada, but you also come from this community where this is practiced. And I wonder what you make of that debate and how you've managed to navigate through it.
I think that the issue is really about how do we be good allies when we are not part of a community where these debates, are centered. So when it comes to female genital cutting or mutilation, I think what people can do is they can really follow the lead of the social change agents from those communities. So in every community where this is practiced, there are feminists who are speaking out about it and who are creating the change in their own culturally specific way within their communities. So that's an important piece too. So for example, in some communities, they might be creating safe houses for girls to run away to. In other communities, they might be working with the cutters, understanding that those cutters rely on their income, and how can they help them have other sources of income. They work with those cutters to be the change agents themselves, to educate them about sexual health. In the Bohra community, we do a lot of education about what are the impacts of all of this, and is it really religiously required? No, it's not. So I think that when there are these debates, just follow the change agents within the communities. There will always be these people who are not the change agents, the people who are regressive, the people who want to maintain a practice, who have bought into patriarchal messages. Those are not the people to follow. You know, in our own community, we started doing a lot of very public media savvy stuff in 2015, and a year or two later, a backlash group started trolling us every day on Twitter, and they, you know, make these outrageous claims about how Kutna actually improves someone's sex life. You know, all the research suggests opposite. So they just, you know, it's all fake news that they put out, and lies and all of that.
It's a fascinating idea here that to look for the helpers, right? So I think another way to frame what you just said is, who are the people that are trying to help rather than hurt? And though there are many people who are trying to hurt, and they try to reframe what they're doing as helping, but it's just so clearly not true. And if you find the ones who are helping, finding the ones who are trying to bring sunlight into the conversation, as they say, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, then those are the people that maybe we should be supporting. You mentioned sex life, and I think that this is something, when we talk about female genital cutting, there of course is the psychological impacts on someone, there are the physical trauma of the pain of that experience, but there's also sometimes the purpose of Kutna, which is to reduce sexual pleasure for a female, and sometimes also with male circumcision, it's seen by some as reducing pleasure for males. And this is such an interesting part of the conversation, and I'm so glad when I was reading your book that you didn't shy away from this, not just in terms of what that means, but what it means for Sharifa. And in the very beginning of the book, we start learning about Sharifa's personal life, her relationship with her husband, the sort of affair that she has had, although it wasn't an affair that had physicality to it. It was an online and just as real, an emotional affair, so to speak. We start with that affair, and then we learn very specifically about her struggles to be a romantic partner, a sexual partner, and her inability to have ever orgasmed in her life. And I was so glad that wasn't shied away from, because I think that there's a lot of books and material about this that that's uncomfortable, and they stay away. So first of all, thank you. But also, was that ever a question for you? Were you ever, should I really get into this?
Never. It was never a question. I love writing about sex and sexuality. I think because it's another one of those taboo subjects. And I know there are so many scenes in books that I've read where, you know, the lights go off and scene. And, you know, sexuality is such an important aspect of our lives. And why aren't we talking about it more? So in all of my books, I've tried to create full sexual lives for all of my characters. And it was really important here because Kutna has had such an impact on all of the characters, and I wanted to bring that in. And I was also really curious about looking at long-term impacts of infidelity. So, you know, as a psychotherapist, this is something I work with my clients all of the time. And so I thought, you know, wouldn't it be kind of cool if I could drop that in? And I didn't want to make Sharifa a villain so early in the book. So that's why I created an online affair for her, so that there was this sort of fuzzy gray area. So what's also important for me in talking about this issue is not just the sexual harms that are created through Kutna, but how do we recover? How do we reclaim sexuality after trauma? And this could be after any form of sexual-based or trauma that happens. Because I think about that a lot too as a psychotherapist with clients, is so someone has experienced a sexual assault, how do they reclaim their bodies? Because the central message of sexual trauma is you don't own your body. So how do you own it again? And one of the funny little inadvertent things that has come out of this is I started an advice column, which is super fun for me. This advice column, it's with a group called SAIO, which is another one of the anti-Kutna groups that exist. And so it's called Dear Masi, and it's a new advice column on sexuality and relationships. So I'm Dear Masi, and I'm giving out sex advice, and it is so fun.
That's wonderful. Is there a website, or how do people find that?
Yeah, people can just go to sahiyo.com. So that's SAHIYO.com, and you'll find it.
Perfect. That was one thing in the book, that there's all these different terms of reference for family members, Masi being one of them, probably the main one, because that's such an important character, Tassin and Masi. But it's sometimes hard to keep track of, and it's also fascinating because in the North America Anglophone tradition, we have brother, sister, daughter, granddaughter, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother. It's pretty simple, straightforward, cousin, second cousin, whatever. But there's all these different terms for different people, which I think
Yes.
to the network of family and familial community, which is something that we don't have as often in North America, but is so prevalent in this culture. And I wondered if that was not just a pleasure to write about, but if there are important ramifications on those familiar relationships, and that strong sense of relational community that comes to play in this conversation about Khatna.
Yes. And can I say it was also a little bit challenging to figure out how to write all of that, because I didn't want to confuse the reader. And so in some places I would offer a little bit of explanation and then I would leave it alone. But yes, we have all of these terms for different relationships. So yes, for different kinds of aunts, even different kinds of grandparents. So I did my best to not confuse the reader, I hope. But yes, family and family relationships are really central to so many cultures, and also all of these relationships are so important in either perpetrating Khatna or stopping Khatna. And just a little tangent from that, I have this recurring thread of the great-great-grandfather, who Sharifa is researching, who comes in and out. And I really wanted to have him in there because I think that our ancestors are huge in terms of what they leave for us, their legacies. We have inherited so much, and of course we also have free will and we create new history for ourselves. But so much of what Sharifa is experiencing in this book is directly connected to her great-great-grandfather. So I wanted to make sure that that was shown in this book.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting device too, just in terms of a literary device for Abdul Ali, the person that she's trying to research, as this sort of MacGuffin, something that she needs to go after and go find. They say every good story is a detective story, and certainly that's true here as she goes back to India. But what it highlights is that not only is Abdul Ali and Abdul Ali's wives so important to Khatna, so important to her story, but it also says that look at how impactful the past remains. And I think for Sharifa lives in New York with her partner and her daughter, living their lives. India might as well not exist in terms of what they're doing day to day. But that's not true, because the past and the other side of the planet have huge influences on her and her family, and potentially on her 7-year-old daughter, Z. And I think that the impact of the past and the impact of the other side of the planet is something that we sometimes take for granted or forget about. But it obviously becomes more than background. It becomes the foreground in this book. And was that an interesting, I guess, juggling act for you as a writer to maintain, for Sharifa and her family, one foot in the present, in New York, or in just the year 2016, and one foot in these other realms, so to speak?
It wasn't a challenge to do that, actually, because that has really been my lived experience. So once again, I'll say this is fiction, but often authors have to say that because we are mining our own lives, we're mining our families' experiences, we're mining our own memories. Anyway, so I grew up. I live in Canada, and I grew up in Canada, but home was always India. That's what my parents would say. Home, when so and so is calling from home. So we had already been living in Canada a long time, but home was India. And so, while my home was at that time Whitby, Ontario, I still had the sense of this monolithic home. And definitely what our relatives thought of us mattered. So I grew up in a family where my father renounced the religion as a young man, and my mother was lukewarm. She still wanted some ties and some connection to religious rites. So I had some of her influence, I had my father's influence, and then we would see our extended family, some of whom are very Orthodox. So I also had their influence. And what they thought, what the Orthodox people thought of us was really quite important. There would be a lot of stress and tension when they would come to visit the house, and I knew it. Um, and then we would go to India, and there would be these moments of knowing that this is supposed to be this special home place for me, but I don't fit in, and I don't know half of what's going on around me. I don't understand sometimes the conversations and the conversations' meanings. But I knew that it was home, and these people were very, very important to us. So it wasn't hard because all of these influences were always with me as I was growing up.
One point in this conversation from Farzana that I think is worth remembering is that the psychological harm of female genital mutilation can be greater than the physical harm or even the emotional harm. We have to ask ourselves, therefore, what does it mean for the girls and the women who are traumatized in this way, not just at the time that it happens, but for the rest of their lives? Now, coming up in this episode, we talk about a bunch of different things, including Meghan Markle in a weird way, but we also tackle the writing process and how specifically Farzana has been able to write a book like this that is at the same time personal and very historical. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. So this is kind of a question both for you then and also for Sharifa. You mentioned how we have this pressure from family that are far away or in the past who may be Orthodox, believe completely different things. And I just wonder, why is that? Like, what's underneath that? Why do we feel such pressure? Is it just because our parents told us that this was home? Is it just because there's this feeling that there's family, whatever that may mean? I mean, family in many ways is just a construct. But why do we feel such pressure, both you and Sharifa or any of us?
I think it's what you said earlier about how we've just absorbed all of these messages and we don't even know that we've absorbed the messages. So, I would have, and Sharif would have, absorbed all of these messages. So they're just kind of in there, and then they become a source of what we imagine to be our identity. So it's not until, we say, no, I don't want this, or yes, I want that. We make some clear decisions. And a lot of people don't make clear decisions, right? They just move forward with the influences that they have, that we would change that. So for example, in my father's situation, he made a very specific decision to renounce the religion, which came with great risk to him. In our community, there's social shunning, and the most common response to apostasy is that you are evicted from the family. Now that didn't happen for him, but he was subjected to lots of judgment. And that's where all the tension would come in. And that would be, the influences that I would have felt and not even known what it was all about.
It's so interesting because there are echoes of that in North America and, again, white Anglophone culture where for me included, like I am not a religious person. I don't have any affiliation with any church or religious organization, but I can see why that is so appealing to people and has been so appealing to people for the sense of purpose, community, the networking that it brings together, a sort of surrogate family. Whether you have a family or you don't, it provides a sense of that community and that deeper community, not just like, oh, that's my neighbor and I better, help them with their lawn so they'll help me with my lawn. It's so much more than that. And there are things that we lack if we don't have that, which is, I think, another reason why it's so brave for someone like your father to have said, I'm out. Because you're not, what they say that the worst punishment than death is exile, to be completely cut off from your fellow. And there's a big pressure, I think, for people to remain part of religious groups, or remain part of organizations, remain part of, even if they're not religious, but just remain part of communities, say the military being one, where there's such a strong sense of brotherhood and sisterhood. That we just don't want to give it up. So I'd rather believe things that I don't really believe in order to stay a part of it. And I think that sometimes is apparent in this book too. Yeah.
Yes, and it's often what I think people do is they might not believe everything, but they will go along. And so I think that's what's happened with Kutna is that people have maybe had a funny feeling about it or, don't think it's such a good idea. But if they don't think it's harmful because they've never had the education to tell them that it's harmful, they might just go along because that's the price of being part of a community is you sometimes have to do things that you don't feel that comfortable with. And so it does take a lot of strength to say, I refuse. And just another piece about community and belonging. I'm a diasporic kid. I wasn't even born in India. My parents were in Zambia for 5 years. I was born there. Then we came to Canada. And often there's this sense of like, where are you from? Where do you belong? Like, who are you? What's your identity? And I've often felt a little bit like I didn't have a place where I belonged, even though I could say, I spent a lot of years growing up in Whitby, Ontario, and then I moved to Toronto, and I really identify with this neighborhood, and I love, the people in my neighborhood. I've also felt like I don't have a sense of belonging, and in the book, Sharifa and her cousins go to their ancestral village, Dolka. And to write the book, I wanted to go there myself to do research, to get a sense of what does this place actually look like and what would it feel like to be a character walking around in this ancestral village. And I had this amazing moment where we ended up being on the street, standing in front of my great-grandmother's previous home. And I had this feeling of being rooted somewhere, like for the first time in my life, where I was like, this little patch of land is where I am from. I might not know my way around this village that's now a big town, and I might not know any of these neighbors, and I might not even be able to communicate with them very well. However, this is where I'm from. So yes, it is important to have some sense of that.
That sounds like a really powerful and wonderful experience. I wanted to ask you about research and the process of writing, not just this book, but any of your books, and the process that you go through. But for this one specifically, you went to India. How did you do the research? Did you do the research first and then write the book, or did you begin writing the book and then research and then second draft? How did it all work together for you?
It was a mix of different things for different threads. So I had already started doing a bit of research about the great-great-grandfather character who is inspired by my own great-great-grandfather. So I had been trying to get more information about this figure in our own family, and I didn't get very far. And I thought, if I want to write about him, I've got to fictionalize him. So I think I'm going to have him in this book. But I did a lot of sort of oral history interviewing of family members. And so that was one piece of research that was happening. And then around Kutna, I was really paying a lot of attention as I was doing my activism. I would listen very carefully to all the stories that I was hearing. I was figuring out my own experience. I, watched a film, I read a book about Bohra. So that was happening as I was writing, as I would come up against something and think, do I know enough about that? How does that work? What if I'm wrong? Because also growing up as a Bohra in Canada means that, you have kind of partial knowledge about things. Plus people aren't very good at explaining why we do anything. So I needed to go and find out why we do things. I actually read a book called Mullahs on the Mainframe, which is by an anthropologist named Jonah Blank. So he's this white American guy, and he helped me to decode so many aspects of why Bohras do Bohra things. So there was a lot of research that was happening as I went along.
That's actually a book that I remember coming from this book that made me think, I want to read that book. That sounds so interesting. Were there moments in your research where you discovered something you didn't expect and had to change tack, had to change course?
I think as some of the true things were going on around legal cases, there have been a number of legal cases, for example, in Detroit, in Sydney, Australia, and there's also a big legal Supreme Court challenge happening in India right now. As those things were happening and as we were gathering more information, I needed to go back and make some changes so that what was happening with Sharifa and her cousins sort of closely resembled what was happening in reality.
Yeah, it's interesting, the process of research, how you have to be open to the unexpected. And because then for us as the reader, we can take that similar course and be surprised by a book rather than follow the course that is set out from page one. Like again, that detective story idea that there are twists and turns, as there are twists and turns in writing it. But again, back to the writing this book, I wanted to ask, it's questions I always like asking writers, so forgive me, but what do you use to write? Do you use a computer? Do you write longhand? What's your style?
So as I was starting to write this book, I was really busy with promoting my third novel, All Inclusive, and so I had no time. But I was like, my head was so full, and like fully formed scenes were coming out. So I would sit down with my cup of coffee first thing in the morning with a notebook, and I would just write these fictional scenes. And I pretty much filled that whole notebook. And then when I had a bit more brain space, when the promotion for All Inclusive had kind of come, to a close, or the pacing was better, I was able to then put it all into a Word document. Sometimes I've also used Scrivener for previous books. It's a nice way to organize things. But for this, I just put everything into Word.
Interesting. When you were writing in a notebook, does it matter to you if the notebook is too nice or too crappy, or is there anything specific about that, or any paper will do?
Any paper will do, but I did have a really nice one that was, it's like hard bound. It's got this magnet clasp thing that closes it. And it was just really easy to rest in my lap because it was so substantial. So I think that helped. The pages are really thick. Somebody gave me this really good notebook. But the other thing that I think is helpful for writers is to carry much smaller notebooks that you can fit into like a back pocket or a purse or something, so that you can grab at any time you've got one of these moments where like a fully formed scene is just kind of coming out of you. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Pen or pencil?
Pen. Oh, absolutely.
Pen. Yeah. No, I'm the same. I just find always sharpening the pencil or using one of those click pencils just is so frustrating. I'd rather not. Yeah.
You want to be able to use force in your hand depending on what you're writing, right? And I know that you're writing a memoir, right? And so I bet you're having these kind of fully formed scenes coming out of you as well as a memory unlatches itself, right?
Sure. Sometimes for me, it's difficult because I find I can be so much more expressive on a piece of paper. No matter how good a computer becomes at receiving my artistic impulses, whatever that means, I can do anything I want on a piece of paper. I can move the pen in any direction. I don't have to use the programming of another device as an intermediary between me and what I want to do. So if I want to draw something, or if I want to, again, I write really hard. I push down really hard. I don't know why. I'm also kind of a rusher. I like to rush things, which is a bit of a problem, but I push down hard with my pen. And if I look back, I can see the times I was pushing down hard and the times I was just really quickly trying to get something out. And those are different emotional states, and they have an impact on what the writing is.
Yes. I feel cooler emotionally when I'm doing a first draft of a scene on the computer. And I feel like I am much more embodied and in the emotions when I'm writing with a pen. Yeah,
it's interesting because, I feel the same. There's something emotionally tactile about writing on paper, but I hate transcribing. I just find it so tedious, and it actually prevents me sometimes from getting the work done because I would just rather not. And maybe it's deeper than that. Maybe there's a feeling when you're transcribing, you have to rewrite what you don't like anymore, or what you are now second guessing, or the editor is coming in and telling you what's bad or what's good, which is a process that needs to happen, but maybe much, much later.
Yes, much, much, much later. Yeah.
Writing is rewriting, right?
Yes.
Did you have people who were really influential in helping you craft this book, whether it was as editors or advice, or to do some of the rewriting, or to read a scene and get back to you, anything like that?
Yes, I had beta readers who would check my cultural, language, religion references in case I, was wrong about those things. I also had, I worked with my agent, Rachel Litovsky, in early drafts of this book, and she was really helpful in helping me sort out the Abdulali scenes. I think initially I didn't have him in there as a thread, and I think she encouraged me to do that, and then she encouraged me to figure out how to intersperse them. She also helped me to figure out the ending, which I won't talk about because it's a spoiler alert, but she was really influential in helping me to sort that out.
Last question about process, which is related to what you just said. Do you like to have complete privacy for your writing and then you bring someone in at the correct time? Or do you work more like with an open door where people come in and out, where you're happy to show someone a scene? How private are you with that first draft?
I'm pretty private with the first draft. I like to have the best first draft that I can produce before I show it to other people. So I like to get rid of as many, there's always typos, but as many typos as possible. I like to be at a place with it where I'm like, I can't think of it. How else I'm going to improve this? So then I want to use the next person's brain to take me just a little bit further. So I don't want to give people anything too soon. I have been in writing groups in the past where we would share a scene or a chapter at a time, and I found that very frustrating because often the questions would be about what was written in the chapter before or the chapter after. So I feel like people really do better if they have a complete manuscript for them to be able to offer suggestions about, where it lagged or where the plot didn't make sense or where they got lost or where they were bored.
Absolutely. Great. I really enjoy those questions about process. So thank you very much. I just, one of my final questions, and it's a question that always kind of caps these off, usually anyways, which is, is there one thing that we haven't addressed in our conversation that if you and I had another hour to kick around, we would tackle? What would that question or that idea, that issue be?
Yes, I think one of the things I've been really enjoying talking about, there are two things. Can I do two things?
Absolutely. Of course you can.
Okay. So the first thing I like to talk about with people who are interested in this issue of FGC is to really understand that this isn't a weird thing that happens to weird people over there. This is like something that is on a continuum of violence that happens. So it's not unrelated to rape culture. It's not unrelated to sexual harassment. It's all about really controlling women and non-binary people's sexuality. So I like people to understand that. And then that makes the issue less queasy for us to talk about and much more, we can approach it more easily. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. And the other piece around that is we're hearing about stories of female genital cutting coming out of Russia and Colombia and white Christians in the US. And so I have a feeling that as we continue to normalize the conversation around this, we'll come to understand that this is a much more prevalent issue, which is horrible. But I think also when we normalize it, we'll be able to stop it. So that was the first thing. The other piece is I've been talking with people about how do you write really heavy topics in a way that is fun or interesting or entertaining for a reader, because that is a challenge. That's a hard balance to strike. And so one of the things that I really tried to do was to just have a regular story happening throughout all of this. So regular relationship foibles, lots of jokes, lots of silliness in there, lots of tender relationships. So I want people to know that it is possible to write heavy issues, and it's a good idea because we need to be talking about social justice in our novels, and also for readers to know that that this book is something that is fun to read too.
Of course, yeah. Well, one thing, I think I mentioned it a bit earlier, is that when you first start this book, it's not immediately apparent the heaviness and the heavy subjects that you're going to be delving into. In fact, you become first and foremost interested in the character, interested in her relationships with her husband, her daughter, and her family, and interested in this journey back to India. And so the deeper issues at play are wrapped in something that is much more, not just relatable, but fun. going back to India to feel a piece of home or to get to know your family better. We can all understand that, even if it's just going back to my hometown or my home neighborhood 5 minutes away. We all get that. But I wanted to go back to that first point you mentioned about the interconnectivity of these issues and how they relate to something that we all understand. So this is a bit of hearsay, but my wife told me that she watched a documentary about Meghan Markle, the wife of Prince Harry. I know almost nothing about Meghan Markle, the royal family. It's not an interest of mine. I would rather that Canada did not have a royal family. I'm not really into that stuff, but
Agreed.
I'm certainly not into the tabloid culture of it, for sure. But my wife watched this documentary and she said, wow, like Meghan Markle's a really interesting, dynamic, smart person who would be so much better off if she wasn't part of that mess. Like, is so much better than these people. And could and had achieved so much more and could achieve so much more and may still achieve so much more now that they've had this divorce, so to speak, from the family. But that wasn't really my point. What I realized as she was telling me this about this documentary was, why did Meghan Markle, and this is, again, I don't really know if this is true, but become such an enemy of the tabloid culture? And I realized if she was a guy dating a female, it would have been complete. His achievements would have been heralded. If this was a guy with her background marrying into the family, but to the princess or whatever, wow, this guy's amazing. Look at all the things that he's done with his life. Well, why do we treat her like such garbage because she's a mixed race female? And I realized it's all related. And the issues dealt with in this book 7, specifically about female genital cutting, which probably has nothing to do with Meghan Markle, it actually does. They're connected on a deep level. And they're only connected not just in today, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years into the past. And if we don't understand those connections, then not only does this book become less interesting, or Meghan Markle become less interesting, if it could be less interesting, but we can't solve those problems if we're unable to make those connections. And that was something that I was able to make that connection. And maybe that's completely spurious, but it was fascinating to me nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about the patriarchy, and it's all about all of us addressing the patriarchy in whatever form we can, right? In whatever way we can. And I like the connection to Meghan Markle because she suffers. Even though she's this woman with all of this privilege, she's also suffering because people aren't seeing her as, an autonomous human being. And I think the other piece that I like to mention is that sometimes people will say, but it's the women who perpetrate this against, the children. And I think that women can also be really impacted by the patriarchy. The author Muna El-Tahawi talks about how women are often, put into the role of the foot soldiers for the patriarchy. And this is something that, it's going to take a long time. And we've had this wonderful Me Too movement that's come out. And I think we're having a Me Too movement around female genital cutting as well. I'm so pleased to be part of that movement.
Yeah, it's a wonderful moment. And I certainly hope that we can put this to an end. And I'm glad that you're a warrior for that, because it needs to be done. Farzana, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And this has opened a lot of doors in my mind, and hopefully for other people too.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really enjoy the conversation too.
To learn more about Farzana Doctor, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode, about any other, and what future guests and subjects you'd like to have discussed on this podcast. Now, your quote of the week is from Malala Yousafzai, who says, "We are human beings. We make the traditions, so we should have the right to change those traditions." Thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to Farzana Doctor for taking the time to have this wonderful conversation. Finally, I'd like to thank our communications and social media coordinator, Danielle Kondrak, who has done a fantastic job of promoting this podcast over the past few months. If you want to get in touch with her, just get in touch with the podcast. I'll see you next time.